Hello, and welcome to Face to Face. Our guest today is Kevin Annett. Kevin is from Nanaimo. He is an author and an award-winning filmmaker. He's currently working as a community minister and educator, and we're going to be talking about two things today. We're going to be talking first about a genocide that occurred in Canada, a genocide of Native people. And secondly, we're going to be talking about Kevin's story as he helped uncover that genocide. Kevin, I don't know where you'd want to start, but you mentioned earlier an apology by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Maybe we can start with that.
Well, that's the issue that a lot of people know about because it was so widely covered in the media, mainstream media. In July 2008, Stephen Harper in Parliament acknowledged that the residential schools were a bad thing. And he made a formal apology on behalf of Canada to the tens of thousands of people who were still alive who went through these. I don't like to call them residential schools because half the children never came back. They weren't really schools, they were really internment camps for Native people. But the fact that that acknowledgement was in some way beginning was a result of a long history of pressure and really a movement to expose the true story of the residential schools that I've been very much involved in for the last 15 or so years.
So what's the story?
The story is that Canada, in league with the Catholic, Anglican, and United Church, set out to, the word they like to use is assimilate, which is not at all accurate because it wasn't really, in the long run, an attempt to bring Native people into the culture. It was really an attempt to wipe out large sections of the Native population under the guise of religion and education and take their land and contain the remaining people who were alive in what was really a model for the South African apartheid regime. It was the Indian residential schools, the reservation system, and the Indian Act, which was designed to contain the survivors of this outright genocide that really, for example, on the West Coast here, killed over 90 to 95% of the Native population that was here in the 1800s, was gone by the early 20th century.
No, I've never heard that number before. That's you are saying, and this is correct,
yes,
that 90 to 95% of the Native people who lived here in the, let's say, in the 1800s, when the Europeans were coming and basically imposing themselves, there was a 90 to 95% death rate of Native people.
That's right, on average on the West Coast, over a period, now that spanned between about the early to mid-1800s, when the first smallpox wave hit, and then around 1920 when they did the final census, survey of the Native population. The population had fallen on average by 90%. That's talked about in anthropological and historical texts and other things. Not talked a lot because,
not talked a lot about
very much
in the media or
because
our school books.
It kind of goes against the whole attitude Canadians have of themselves, is that we're a liberal humanitarian nation. Down in the States, they killed off Indians like that, but not up here. Well, the figures show otherwise. As a matter of fact, right here on the coast, and I talk about this in our documentary film, Unrepentant, which we made a few years ago. Right here on the West Coast, there was a Native woman, Harriet Nahani, who described how in her village called Klaus, which is near Port Renfrew, right on the West Coast, she said in the 1860s, there was a population of around 3,500 people. There were 44 people left by 1890. So in about a generation, you had a 95% die-off rate. And that was primarily due to smallpox. The depopulation happened after that in the residential schools, largely through the deliberate spreading of tuberculosis. So for example, in our film, and with a lot of the people I work with, you hear these stories continually of how healthy children were taken by nuns and priests and others and put in the same dormitory as young children who were dying of tuberculosis, and then they never treated them. They just allowed the TB to spread. And there was a massive die-off rate. Matter of fact, a government official called Dr. Peter Bryce, who was worked for the Department of Indian Affairs, he did a tour of Western Canada in around 1907. And he released a report which showed that the average death rate in these residential schools was around 50%. So after a few years, half the children are dead. And that was reported in the Ottawa Citizen. We have all of those documents in my book and in our film Unrepentant. The amazing thing, Jack, is that all of this information is out in the public media. It's talked about openly, and yet, to use that phrase, all of this goes down the memory hole. It's like people are educated in Canada not to know these things, because the facts, just that simple fact of a 50% death rate continuing over decades, not just one event, but decade after decade in these residential schools, clearly that shows an intent to depopulate Canada so that the settlers and various companies can move in and get the land. That shouldn't be unusual, too preposterous an idea when you look at the history of colonialism all over the world. That's exactly the way those things happen. So,
but I think most people listening to this and watching this will find it absolutely shocking. I mean, I find it shocking myself. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can go through some of the numbers. When did this begin? This die-off? And what were the actual numbers of the population of? Are you talking about British Columbia or the West Coast?
Well, we're talking the West Coast generally.
Okay. So what would the population have been at a certain point in time?
It's hard to estimate pre-contact. There have been various figures. I remember when I studied anthropology at UBC, the general figure was somewhere between 1 and 2 million Native people could have been sustained on the coast here because of the very rich marine resources. We know in Haida Gwaii, in the Queen Charlotte Islands, very complex society developed there, tens of thousands of people. And just on the basis of living off the resources of the sea. That was unique in the world. I mean, you don't really get many examples of that around the world. So we had a very evolved, developed societies here when the Europeans arrived.
So you're saying then that a reasonable estimate of the number of people living on the West Coast prior to the Europeans coming, and an accepted number in university terms would have been 1 million to 2 million people.
Easily, yeah. And we know
that's
that...
shocking.
Well, we know that as a fact because when you just extrapolate from some of the larger communities that were encountered by the first missionaries, and when you read their journals, they describe villages of thousands of people. That figure of 1 to 2 million is not inconceivable. By 1920, you're down to 20,000 Native people in British Columbia. So that's about... if on average you're talking 90% die-off, then taken up from that, then yeah, you're easily 10% of, 200,000 people is 20,000. So, I mean, you were talking in the hundreds of thousands who were here originally. In a way, the numbers are not even the critical question here, because we know that the loss of and the wiping out of an entire culture, that's what's called genocide. You don't have to go out and intend to kill off all the people. Genocide is defined as simply any attempt to destroy any part of a people, destroy their way of life, their attitudes, their possession of their own land. And that's clearly what happened in Canada. By any definition, by the United Nations definition on genocide, Canada and what they did in the residential schools qualifies clearly for acts of genocide. Now, it didn't happen in the same way across the country. It happened very intensely in the West in a very short period of time, because when the railway opened up the whole country in 1886, you had the settlers pouring in to an area that still was predominantly native land, where whites were a small percentage. Within about 10 or 20 years of the railway opening up, the settlers and the various companies that are associated with the Europeans, logging companies, the mining companies, all that, they're needing access to the land quick. And when you find the letters, continually the government, we have to get these natives off their land. We've got to give the children a Christian education. That, under the guise of educating them and saving them from the so-called heathen way of life, that was the pretext for forcing people off their land and depopulating large areas. And like I say, the residential schools were clearly the main mechanism in Western Canada to do that. And we have all the evidence, including proof that there were sterilization clinics operated up and down the coast, where Native men, women, and children were taken in, and under a law passed in BC in 1933, any Native person could be sterilized by the decision of the principal of the school that they were attending. So, we estimate, for example, the United Church ran a sterilization clinic in Bella Bella, the RW Large Hospital, the Nanaimo Indian Hospital. In Duncan, there was a place called the King's Daughters Clinic. We have eyewitness testimonies of women who were sterilized in these clinics as recently as the 1960s and even in the early 70s. All of those things were legal in Canada under the sterilization laws. So The UN says that when you're trying to stop a people from breeding and procreating, that's clearly the most positive proof of genocide. And that had been going on in Canada for a long time.
It really is shocking, because like many people who are watching this, I've lived my whole life here in Canada, the last 25 years here in Victoria.
Yeah.
And it comes as a real shock in spite of, you hear stories about the residential schools, but nothing like this.
Well, it was a shock to me, too. I was raised, in Winnipeg in a United Church family. I always had the attitude, well, that's the more liberal denomination. They ordain homosexuals. They're against nuclear war, all of this stuff, right? And so as a minister, maybe I'll just go a little bit into my personal background. When I was ordained in the United Church in 1990. In Vancouver, where I'd done all my education. I had 2 master's degrees at the University of British Columbia. And I finally went through for the ministry and became ordained in 1990. And in 1992, I ended up in Port Alberni, hired unanimously there by a dying congregation of mill workers and retired people, St. Andrew's United Church. And within about a year, I had tripled the size of the congregation. I'd brought a lot of new people in, including Native people for the first time. And Port Alberni, of course, is still a fairly divided community in a lot of ways. But back then, one of the first things I noticed when I looked out on I remember my first service in August of 1992, my fledgling sermon there, I looked out and there was 20 people sitting in the pews, and they were all white. And I went up to the chair of my board after, and I said, I know you're wanting me to bring in new blood, and the first question I have to you, Fred, is why there are no Native people here, because they're a third of the population, and I know they've had a relationship with the United Church. I didn't know anything at that point about the local residential school.
So at that time, you were totally unaware, like
as ignorant
many of
as
us.
most white people about what happened with my own church. I didn't even know that there were residential schools. And anyway, I said to Fred, it's really odd. There are no Native people here. Like, where are they all? And he got really defensive and said, they keep to themselves and we keep to ourselves. And, that's the way it is here, and just get used to it. So that got me really curious. And it was interesting because very soon after that, I was called out to a home. I got a phone call from a man called Danny Gus, who was a retired Native fisherman. And he lived right on the grounds of, if you go to Port Alberni, the New Chelmsford Tribal Council office on River Road is right on the grounds of the old Alberni Residential School. They, in fact, took over the building and ran it as their tribal council office. And Danny Gus's house was right next door, and we were sitting in his living room. He wanted to get married, he and his partner, after living together 30 years, so I did the wedding ceremony in their living room. We were sitting around after drinking tea, and he said, I asked him fairly off the cuff, Danny, why aren't there any Indians coming to the United Church? And I'm just kind of curious. And he didn't say anything right away. And finally, he kept looking out the window. And finally, he said, they killed my best friend in the residential school here, and he's buried in the hills behind the school. And everybody in the church knows that, and that's why they don't want us in their church, right? That was the first visit I did in a Native home. I heard that story. Literally every home I went into after that, I was hearing these stories from Native people. And, it blew me away. I mean, I didn't know what to do with that. My first reaction was, well, they just are saying this because they don't like whites, because look what we did to them, right? They're sitting here on reserve, they lost their land. But more and more people were telling the same story over and over. And my first reaction was to go to the church officials and tell them about this, because I figured, well, if we really do this, we're going to own up. I mean, that was my logical assumption, that we would want to get to the heart of what happened and do the right thing. I was told in no uncertain terms that I better stop looking into this, that they were all lying. There was no proof of any of this. Now, don't forget, this was in 1992. That was 4 years before the lawsuits had begun against the first, brought by the residential school survivors against the United Church. That didn't start till 1996. 1992, the churches were free to simply lie about it all, say we didn't do anything, nobody was harmed. That was still the official line then. I was told by minister after minister that, you better watch it, Kevin, not to believe this stuff the Indians are telling you, because we did only good out there. I kept hearing that phrase all the time. We only did good. We wanted to do good. We wanted to educate people and do all these good things. And categorically denied that children had been harmed, that nobody had died. I mean, I heard that continually. And I was, in fact, warned that if I kept listening to these stories, it might jeopardize my career in the United Church. So it was a direct kind of, hammer in the glove type of warning that not to believe these things. But I couldn't deny what people were telling me. And after, like I said, after a year or two, our congregation had grown, and I had an open pulpit policy, so I would let people get up and speak after my sermon, and it was very much like an open forum in our church. And Native people eventually began to get up and speak, and from the pulpit they began to tell the same things. They talked about these crimes they'd witnessed.
So now, I mean, at that time, within your church, there were Native people who were members, and everything was, at least to that extent, fine. It was a mixed membership within that congregation.
Very much. There was a lot of other things happening too. We opened a food bank. We formed a group called Low Income Folks Together, which was the first kind of, actually in the history of the Alberni Valley, was the first time natives and non-natives got together in a community action group. LIFT was trying to not only improve the conditions of homeless people, but we were trying to get social housing. We tried to set up a land trust where a lot of the unused timber lying around from all the logging could be used in cooperative sawmills, so we could give jobs to people, that kind of thing. So we were working on a lot of issues, not just how Native people had been harmed. And that is something that also kind of ticked off McMillan Bloedel, because we were criticizing MacBlow and their misuse of the land. We called for the tree farm license to be taken away from MacBlow and given, to the people in the valley, especially the Native people who needed work. So, all that began to kind of step on the toes of the local power brokers. But what, there were, from the 20 people who were in the congregation, by 2 years later that we had 120 people coming out to church every Sunday. A lot of political activism, a lot of debate happening. This was, if you remember, it was right when the Clayoquot protests were happening, the anti-logging protests. And I had members of my congregation, some of them were loggers, some of them were environmental protesters, some Native. So we had everything represented in the congregation. There's a very dynamic thing that we were helping to do in the valley there. But what really brought things to a head was in over 2 years after I got there. It was, I remember very clearly, it was in October 1994. The United Church held, every few months, they had these things called presbytery gatherings where the local ministers get together and just talk over church business and that. And at this presbytery meeting, there was a report made about an issue between the church and the Ahousa Native people on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So this is in north of Tofino, the Ahousa traditional territory there in the Clayoquot Sound. This United Church minister made a report about how the natives were wanting this land back, and he basically lied, because I knew a lot of the Ahousa chiefs. I'd been speaking to them, and he claimed that the Ahousats had never owned the land. The reality is that the Ahousats had been forced to give up that land by this guy John Ross, who was an original missionary who was empowered by the government in 1905 to go in and be the magistrate. So this missionary could arrest any Native person he wanted. He could throw them in jail if they weren't bringing their kids into the residential school. So with that power, he grabbed all this big chunk of land called Lot 363, about 100 hectares, handed it over to the church, so basically stole it from the Ahousa people. In 1953, the United Church takes that land and sells it to a friend of the church, who then flips it to McMillan Bloedel and makes millions of dollars. So when I heard about that, I said, wait a minute, and I looked at the policy in the United Church about Native land claims. And it said whenever land is in the possession of the church that used to belong to a Native nation, that land has to go back to the Native nation and can't be sold off for profit to friends of the church.
So this regulation then was very positive and progressive.
Well, the policy was.
Yeah.
And that's why I felt, I'm just citing the policy. So I wrote a letter to the presbytery about that, saying that we're violating our own policy on Native land claims, and we should sit down with the Ahousats and hand the land back. Now, what I didn't know was that McMillan Bloedel, which is a big recipient of United Church land through the United Church, and in return gave kickbacks to the church, various financial, there was something called the McMillan Family Fund, and they were channeling thousands of dollars into the United Church. So there was kind of a backroom deal where the church would hand over land to MacBlow and get money in return. I found out about that, and I wrote this letter to the presbytery saying we should return the land back to the Ahousats. Within 6 weeks, I was summarily fired without cause, without notice, without any reference to the United Church manual on how you deal with ministers when you're removing them. Just completely illegal firing. Never given a cause at all. Even to the point at which I was finally defrocked, they never gave a cause for my firing.
So you had basically come up against a very powerful force.
Even more powerful than I realized at the time, because what happened, the biggest acquisition in BC history occurred a few years later. Weyerhaeuser, that is the largest logging company in the world, based in Seattle, it buys up McMillan Flodell for very cheaply. And one of the reasons it was able to do that is because it was acquiring all this native land. The Lot 363 prime old-growth red cedar on native land. So this land theft that the United Church was involved in was directly helping this huge corporate takeover. So I was stepping on a lot of big toes, and the provincial government, the United Church, the McMillan Flodell and Weyerhaeuser. So naturally, I mean, the easiest thing to do in that situation, get rid of the troubling minister. But fortunately, I didn't just blow up or what's the term? You dry up and blow away. That didn't happen.
What did happen?
Well, in a nutshell, I was fired January 1995. I had, at the time, my children were 6 and 2 years old. I was married. I was told when I was fired, they handed me and my wife Anne a letter of dismissal. Again, not according to the regulations in the United Church, but just totally on their own. And it said I had to agree to a psychiatric evaluation without citing any evidence. I had to agree to a year's pastoral retraining. I had to close the food bank. I had to stop visiting non-members. By that they meant Indians. And stop preaching about social justice. And if I did all that, I could stay on as a minister in the United Church.
You know, it's interesting because I always think of the United Church as supporting all of these things, and I mean,
well, yes,
considered one of the most progressive, I think, churches.
That was my fatal mistake to think that too, because in theory they are, and on many other issues they might be, but in issues having to do with their complicity in land theft, in the genocide of Native people, of the residential schools
in this area,
they certainly didn't want that coming out, and they still don't want it coming out. So, just to show you what happened, I was fired. I wouldn't agree to those demands. We began to negotiate, myself and the presbytery, about that. But basically, my wife and children and I were out. We were evicted from the manse. We had to eventually move back to Vancouver. They wouldn't let me work in the church anymore because I wouldn't agree to, especially the demand for psychiatric evaluation, which was completely unwarranted. And they themselves admitted that later. They were looking for a reason to get me out quick. And what was most insidious, though, is that about a month after I was fired, church officials went to my ex-wife and they said, this man's not going to be able to work again. This all came out in divorce court about 2 years later in Vancouver. They said, he's not going to be able to work again. And basically, if you leave him, we'll pay for your divorce. And that's in fact what she did. And they gave her documents in divorce court, which made it look like I was mentally unstable, that I was paranoid and couldn't get along with my employer and all this stuff. And she won custody of her 2 daughters. And so within a year, I lost my livelihood, my job, my employability, my family. It was terrible. It was like they came down with a huge hammer on me.
And the story is, of course, much bigger even than that.
Yeah.
Because the history seems to be that many churches were involved in, and of course everybody, not everybody, because I think most people probably knew very little about any of this. But certainly the power structure was involved in this because I guess in different parts of the country, different people were benefiting because the native people had the land.
Very much.
And, going back 100 or 200 years or 300 years, depending on where you were. And that, of course, all changed over periods of time.
Well, yeah, and it's certainly a lot bigger than what happened. It involved the Catholic and Anglican churches, too. Actually, the Roman Catholics ran about 2/3 of the residential schools. So, and it's a much older thing. In fact, you could point to 500 years ago when the first papal laws were passed in the 14 and 1500s that basically sanctioned colonialism. There's two, the Romanus Pontifex and the Inter Caetera. These are 2 laws that are still on the books, and they have never been revoked. They're still, considered part of the great traditions of the Catholic Church. And one of them says that non-Christian peoples do not have the right to their own land, and that it's the obligation of Christian kings to conquer. They were called Saracens and pagans at the time, but any non-Christian had to be conquered, basically. And it sanctioned Spain and Portugal and all the other countries to go and do that all over the world.
Now, years ago, I saw a film called The Missionary, I think it was called. And in that film, I think that was mentioned. Very, yeah.
Right, and the other law, Inter Caetera, which is in 1493, just the year after Columbus went out, the Pope drew a line down the middle of the globe, and he said everything to the west belongs to Spain, everything to the east belongs to Portugal. And everybody who aren't Christians in those areas can be conquered, and if they do not convert, they were to be killed. If they do convert, they're to be enslaved. And that's in fact, what I contend is that that's never changed, because the way the enslavement happens in Canada is through this thing called the Indian Act. There's no other racially targeted law in Canada. Racially specific legislation was actually outlawed by the United Nations, which is why there was a big protest against apartheid in South Africa, because of their racial laws. The racial law in Canada, the Indian Act, is aimed at the people they designate are Indians. You're a ward of the state. You do not have the same right. You're not really a citizen. You're in a gray zone where, for example, if you're living on reserve under the Indian Act, you don't have the right to elect your own council because it can be removed at any time. You don't have the right to make renovations to your home. Your movements are completely restricted. And all the laws are still in the books to establish residential schools, to involuntarily hospitalize Native people. I mean, it's a system of internment of Native people on their own land. And somehow this continues. So, I mean, it shows you that as much as people now are talking about, well, we want to heal, we want to reconcile, we want to get past, that's not going to happen if the laws are still on the books, if the attitude is still that, well, for example, why did Native people die at 20 times the national death rate? Why is tuberculosis never being vanquished in the Native world? Why did Native men and women continue to be killed indiscriminately by the police? All over the country. You see incidents all the time of that happening and nobody really caring. Over 500 missing Aboriginal women in British Columbia. I mean, all of that is because of a history where Native people are not really human, where we have the right to go and destroy them for their own good, and then issue an apology and a bit of money, which is what the churches have done, and think that somehow absolves them. I mean, you go out and you kill thousands of children, and yet issue an apology. I like to say it's kind of like, if you remember Clifford Olson, the serial killer who was apprehended back in the 90s. He had killed, I think it was 7 young girls, tortured them to death. I mean, imagine if Clifford Olson evaded prosecution and jail time by issuing an apology to his victims' families and giving them a bit of money. I mean, nobody would have stood for that, but that's in fact what's happened in Canada, because the Catholic and Anglican United Church have apologized for the residential schools, so they're off the hook. In that apology I mentioned with Stephen Harper in July 2008 in Parliament, no reference to criminal prosecution at all. He acknowledged that children had died. He didn't. Other party leaders talked about mass graves near the former residential schools. A few months earlier, the government and the Indian Affairs had actually acknowledged that criminal acts, including homicide, had occurred in residential schools. They finally acknowledged that. And yet in the same breath, they said there will be no criminal charges laid. So that's saying an amazing thing. They said, well, these churches killed these kids, but they're not going to be prosecuted for it. So, I mean, how can we tolerate that in Canada and call ourselves a humanitarian nation? I mean, we're basically saying it's all right to have done that.
We're talking about BC, but the residential schools, I guess, were across Canada?
They were. They were set up actually under laws brought in the 1890s. You see, these schools had been run all through in the 1800s by missionaries, Catholic and Protestant missionaries, but the government stepped in the 1890s. Again, okay, right within 10 years of the railway opening up the West, you have the Indian Act, you have the RCMP being created to basically war against the Native nations. You have the Department of Indian Affairs set up, and residential schools established, all in the same period of time. And between 1890 and about 1996, when the last school closed.
When did the last school?
1996 in northern Saskatchewan. A lot of them closed in the 1980s and 1970s. But what you had was, during that period of time, probably 250,000 children went through these schools. The government figure is a lot less. But, for example, the laws that were brought in made it a law that any child 7 years and older had to be in these schools or their parents would go to jail. In fact, the Mounties would go into a village and they'd clear out all the children. We have eyewitnesses describing this, up and down the coast here especially. The Mountie gunboat would go in, the whistle would blow, these Mounties would jump off, they'd run around and grab all the children, beat the parents down, tie the children up like it's a slave boat, take everyone, there were 2 and 3-year-olds being taken off into these residential schools. So entire villages cleared out. Imagine in your community if all the children were just stolen one day, what that would do. I mean, we have people describing how the parents would just sit on the beach for days and just moan and not eat and just mourn and waste away because their children being gone. And that's for a reason. That's to destroy the morale and the strength of a community. And if you want to get their land and keep them in that condition, that's what you have to do. So this was kind of a massive assault on every level in Native society. But unlike genocides in other periods, this was aimed at children. You know, the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews was aimed at all of the Jews and all sorts of other groups. But this was aimed specifically at the children. And that's what's so horrible when you think about it, that's what occurred in Canada and the United States. But like you say, it was a national system. There was over 150 of these schools. Again, most of them run by the Catholics, but the Protestants modeled their work on what the Catholics were doing. And they were run jointly by the government and the churches. That's one of the documents I found out. After I got fired from the United Church, I couldn't work anymore. So I started a doctoral degree at the University of British Columbia. And that same year, and this is really what comprises a lot of my book and what our film is based on, this primary evidence I found. We found documents in the Kerner Library at UBC showing that half the children were dying every year, showing that the parents had to sign away legal guardianship rights to the principal of the school. And that was a very important document in court, because when I worked with the first group of survivors that sued the United Church, that document is what compelled the first legal decision. It was called the Brenner decision in June of 1998. The BC Supreme Court Justice Brenner. He ruled that the United Church and the federal government were equally liable for what had happened in the residential school. It was a groundbreaking decision. It really started all the legal action against the churches and the government. And one of the reasons he ruled that was because of a document I submitted in court, which was, it was called the Application for Admission Form, and it showed that the Native parents had to sign away guardianship power over their own child. So they had lost any legal power to say no to get their children out of those schools. And that kind of sealed the fate for legally, the liability was established there. Unfortunately, the government then stepped in and basically annulled the court decision, said, no, government's all responsible, the churches are off the hook. And that's still the state of affairs now. Even the compensation money that they always rave about, the money that you often hear from church people, well, look at all we've done, we've given the money. That money's not coming from the churches, it's coming from taxpayers. We're footing the bill. The churches are totally exonerated for these crimes and aren't even paying for them.
Well, probably everything was done in the name of Canada. Mm-hmm. And the name of, I guess, because who...
And in the name of Christ, so-called.
Yeah. And I guess business, because who wanted the land? You've mentioned the big logging companies, and I guess the big mining companies.
Well, it was very corporate-driven, When the CPR was built, they were given huge tracts of land on either side of the railway. That's why, like in Vancouver, for a long time, this company, Marathon Realty, owned about half the city. Well,
yes,
they're a subsidiary of CPR. I mean, you find that in every Western city, that vastly subsidized, by the federal government, by taxpayers. It's still like that. So Native people were in the way, and they had to be gotten rid of.
I think that's the fundamental point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Native people were in the way,
yep,
and they had to be gotten rid of.
That's right.
But it just seems like some way, because what did happen, although I don't know, because like most people in this country, it's a hidden and dark chapter.
Yeah.
I can remember when these stories started coming out in the media, and of course the media must have been complicit too, because they must have known. People must have gone to the newspapers of the day, even 100 years ago.
Yep.
And I'm assuming they just didn't report it.
Well, they would do briefly. It's still like that now. And I've had a lot of experience dealing with the media. To give you an example of that, we held a tribunal in 1998 after working for a few years in Vancouver at UBC to get my degree, and also in the Downtown East Side with survivors, documented a lot of these stories. We finally held a tribunal that was sponsored by a United Nations affiliate. We brought in human rights observers, and we heard a lot of these crimes for the first time, like the sterilization programs, medical experiments, all of this stuff, terrible stuff happening. We sent this out, the final kind of the invitation and then also the evidence from this. We sent it to the media all over Canada. The Globe and Mail did a short little piece on it. I mean, this is groundbreaking, historical event. We're talking about crimes of genocide in Canada, the most serious crime in Canadian history. Total media blackout on it. I lined up sterilization survivors in Duncan and Nanaimo. I had 8 of them ready to speak to the Globe and Mail. They refused to come over after that. Somebody put a clamp on even the Globe and Mail. For a couple of years after the tribunal, there was utter blackout on this. And there still is in many ways. I mean, we found recently a lot of the emphasis is on trying to identify these graves where over 50,000 children died in these schools, trying to bring back the remains for a proper burial. We released a list of 28 of these mass grave sites to the media. Not one reported it. We began to hold a network. When I say we, there's a whole network of survivors of the residential schools that I work with in Vancouver and Winnipeg and Toronto, right across the country. I do a lot of public lecturing and organizing with these people. And, we were holding protests at churches. At one point, we even occupied a Catholic church during a mass very peacefully. And this got a lot of media attention. When you're actually disrupting something or there's a threat of violence, then they'll report it. But right after that, we're talking about, we have the hard evidence. We know where the grave sites are. You'd think that would be of interest when people are talking about healing and reconciliation and overcoming this long history. You'd think that giving the children a proper burial would be foremost in the minds of people if they really wanted healing. Well, nobody reported it, and the churches for over 5 years have completely ignored all requests by parents or relatives of these children who died to return the remains. So, they can talk about change and everything, but if it's not followed with actual steps, then it's hollow rhetoric.
Let's talk for a minute about healing and reconciliation, because it must be very, very hard for Native people to be willing to reconcile with all of Canadian people regarding this. But you obviously have a close relationship with a lot of Native people. What's their feeling?
Well, as people, they're amazing human beings. I mean, just the capacity to forgive, to remain human, the gentleness and truthfulness around a lot of the Native people now is really incredible, and it was a source of strength for me over the years as I went through so much personal suffering, to be bolstered up by those kinds of people and to see that if they went through that kind of trauma, then I can certainly get through what I'm going through. I mean, that was personally one of the reasons I continue to work with these folks, but as well as a sense of responsibility that it's my culture who did this. I've got to do something about it, right? But what the reality is that, I mean, what I often say to my people, non-Native people, let's say Caucasian Canadians, is, what would you do in their boots if this happened to you? If your culture was wiped out, if your children were taken away and murdered en masse, wouldn't you want to know where they're buried? Wouldn't you want to know who did it? Wouldn't you want them to be held accountable? Wouldn't you want a proper burial for the children? If the people who did it came to you and said, here's $5,000, go ahead and forget it now, please. You'd think that's a crime. You'd think they were trying to pay you off to allow them to get away with it. Yet that's called healing and reconciliation in Canada when the churches do that or when the government does that. An apology and a bit of money is supposed to be enough. Well, that's absurd. You cannot apologize for genocide and mass murder. There's nothing you can do to make it better except do what you would want done yourself. And that's kind of the mental shift we need to make in Canada. We've got to put ourselves in the picture here. This happened to us as well. I mean, all of this was done in our name. We're still paying the price for that. It's kind of like the blowback that happens when you inflict crimes of genocide on other people. It's going to come back. And I'm thinking, when you look at all of the Homeland Security legislation, these, measures now, they've got X-ray machines in the airport, this total draconian regime that's being imposed. The RCMP can go and murder people with tasers and get away with it all the time. They can do that because they've been doing it to Indians for so long. So whatever you do to one people is going to start happening to you. And I think the police state that's kind of spreading across this country in the United States and other countries is because we have been murderous, genocidal societies, and now it's coming back on us. So this is something that very much affects us. And, the old saying, an injury to one is an injury to all. That slogan I learned when I was in the labor movement back in the 70s. I mean, that's a practical piece of advice, because if it happens to them today, it'll happen to you tomorrow. If the same regime is in place, and it is, these institutions that did the crime are still in power, they've never had to be held accountable. There was, the best example I can give of that is, and this was in the news, a United Church minister in Victoria in 1997, Russell Crossley, was convicted of having been a serial rapist. For 30 years in the United Church, he had been sexually assaulting women, and the United Church hierarchy moved him around all over the country. In Victoria, he's finally arrested. He's found guilty, and I think he does like 8 or 9 months, and he gets out. He resumes his ministry in Victoria, and he retires in 2006. Never defrocked. He had a whole list of character references, heads of the United Church, heads of the RCMP coming to say what a great man this was. This wasn't native kids he was raping. These were white women in his congregation. Now, if you allow that to happen, the churches somehow mentally absolve themselves of that. Say, well, we hit a rapist, and he got off, basically. He got his wrist slapped. And if you can do that to yourself and you condone that kind of behavior, it's going to keep going on. And that's, I think, the lesson that, this is not resolved with a bit of money, because it's going to happen again. Because why would it stop?
Can you talk just for a bit about what Native culture was like going back 100 years or 200 years on the West Coast? Because really, I have no idea,
I don't either.
Okay.
I mean, I studied anthropology. I've worked a lot with Native people, but the reality, Jack, is that the culture was pretty much wiped out. I mean, you have a massive die-off rate of 90%. I think there was after Cambodia and the Vietnam War, the U.S. Air Force released a manual that said, if you kill 10% of a nation's populace in a war, you're going to permanently traumatize those people, and they're never going to be able to recover. Well, we're talking 50 to 80 or 90% of the people wiped out. We have no idea what that's like, because we've never lived through it ourselves. I have no idea anymore what Native culture could have been like, and neither do Native people, because it was pretty much wiped out. The first people who die in an epidemic are the old and the young. And the elders in the Native community in an oral tradition are the ones who have a lot of the knowledge. So frankly, most, the language, a lot of the traditions and the ideas and just the way of life was wiped out by these smallpox epidemics, and remnants survived here and there. So it's really impossible to say, frankly, what it was like, despite the pretenses by anthropologists and that to be able to reconstruct things. The fact is we don't know largely, but we do know from a little bit of the archaeological evidence in that these were massive, well-developed cultures. They were not heathens running around in the woods.
That's kind of the question, that's what I'm wondering.
Very much. I mean, if you read any of the Northwest Coast anthropological studies by Franz Boas or any of the Europeans who came here, they describe Northwest Coast culture as one of the most advanced linguistically and culturally in the world. State-level society developing in Haida Gwaii, with kingships, and that's one of the reasons that you see so much Haida art around, because the British, when they came over, were really impressed that the Haida had slaves, that they had kings and slaves. Hey, they're just like us Europeans, so they've got to be civilized. So let's preserve Haida art. They're the advanced Indians, right? We can relate to them. But the reality is that we were dealing with very sophisticated cultures here, and that's why it was. I believe that European powers, relying on the churches, had to take these drastic measures, because there's an account by Governor Douglas in Victoria here when they were being threatened by some of the, and you can read that there's a few books being written about this locally, but local history. The Cowichan natives were threatening Victoria with their war canoes, and right before there was a big war party coming to Victoria, I think it was about 1854. Suddenly smallpox breaks out among the Cowichan people, and about 80% of the villages are gone in a few years from the smallpox. more likely a few months. But when the census was done again, you had that huge fall off. Again, it's used as a weapon. And in my film, Unrepentant, we talk about how there was even a journal kept by a British general called Geoffrey Amherst, where on the east coast of Canada, he described how they took smallpox blankets and infected the Mi'kmaq with them because they were fighting them,
So I think this is something that everybody's heard. This was actually done.
It was documented, yes, that first smallpox and then tuberculosis, that was kind of the development in the germ warfare, basically, we used against Native people. Residential schools were the testing ground for a lot of these things.
So General Amherst, and that's a name that I can remember from the history books. He was quite a famous general in North America.
Amherst, Nova Scotia, Amherst College, there's a lot of places named after him.
And he documented that. Can you just repeat it?
Well, again, if you go to our quote, it's www.hiddenfromhistory.org is the website, and you can watch our film on there. But the quote was, he was writing to his subordinate, and he said, basically, just to paraphrase, you will use every means possible to extirpate this execrable race, which at the time meant to wipe out this horrible race of people. And he ordered them to take the smallpox blankets out of the hospital and distribute it in the Mi'kmaq villages in Nova Scotia. That's in his own handwriting. He's describing that. It's if you go to Mi'kmaq, do a Google search on the Mi'kmaq nation, they publish these journals. So it's in the handwriting of the very people who did it. In a court of law, that's all the evidence you need. You've got the primary evidence, you've got eyewitnesses. The one thing we're lacking in Canada now is the forensic proof, the mass graves, the DNA analysis that'll prove how these children died. That's why we released a couple of years ago this information on the mass graves. But to give you an example, the RCMP who were complicit up to their eyeballs in these residential schools, the RCMP were the ones who cleared out the villages and chased down the runaway kids. Their official position still in Port Alberni, and I called them up last year. I said, what about this mass grave behind the residential school? They said, what grave? And I said, look, we have forensic specialists who went in and did a survey on the ground. They found the sinkholes. They indicate that there's lots of graves back there. So what are you going to do about it? They said, there's no grave back there. I said, well, there were eyewitnesses who saw kids being buried. No, there weren't. I mean, it's just total denial. And, under the law, what they're doing is just colluding in a crime. And that's the problem. The institutions responsible are the ones still in power, so you're going to naturally get continued cover-up and denial about these things. The only reason we knew about the Nazi Holocaust is the Germans lost the war. But we won the war here, so we don't have to be held accountable, and that's the kind of brutal reality.
Where would you suggest that we go from here? Here we are in 2010. What is a way forward to... I mean, you can't solve the problem. You can't bring back dead children or dead people or anything like that. I mean, even I know, as little as I know, that Native culture has been so badly just twisted and torn, and so many of the people have been damaged by it. So how, I mean, maybe not, I shouldn't ask what do you think, but you deal a lot with Native people, obviously. What do they think? What do they want?
Well, when you talk to Native people like the chiefs of band councils and that, who are plugged into the government money system, they tend to see it in a very different way than a Native person on the ground would, like a lot of the homeless people I work with. They know, the people on the ground know that the whole society is arranged against them and their likelihood of dying is very high. They don't hold out a lot of hope. I mean, they don't talk about money or apologies. When they do talk about it, they say, well, we want justice. We want to hold people accountable. We want to face the people who did this. But it's not going to happen. This is Canada, right? I mean, they have a very realistic sense of things. But in terms of how I view it, in response to your question, I think there's a quote from a guy, Rian Malin. He was a white South African who came back after apartheid. He said, when he was trying to understand his own country, he said, we cannot come to terms with something we don't understand. And the reality is, we don't even understand what we are. We don't even understand what we're part of and what our own history is until we understand that and first know what happened. We can't talk about healing. We can't talk about reconciliation. I mean, those are all just words. It doesn't make any difference in reality. As a matter of fact, when you hand out money to people who are drug addicts or alcoholics, they'll kill themselves with it. And that's the reality. The so-called healing programs have caused a huge increase in the death rate in the Native world. because it's done indiscriminately. And I don't think that's accidental.
Because Native people have been given money as compensation, and they're in such bad shape that they simply, the money simply furthers the spiral downwards.
Totally. And I've dealt with people, friends have died from that, the compensation money coming out of Ottawa. So you see, to the white world, it's a solution. On the ground, it's the opposite. And it makes the problem worse. So we can't change until we accept who we are and what we've done. And that's something at every level that's being resisted. The media won't cover this stuff. The churches will not admit to things. The government conceals things. The police do everything possible to avoid criminal prosecution of these churches. So until that changes, I don't think we can. There is no hope for healing and reconciliation. The only way that would change is if a real political and almost spiritual groundswell began in Canada, where we want to accept this history and say we are going to make concrete changes. We're going to get rid of the Indian Act. We're going to bring the children home for a proper burial. We're going to prosecute those people, including those institutions responsible. We're going to take away the charitable tax status of these churches. Why should taxpayers continue to support these churches that were responsible for so many killings and are betraying their responsibility to the community? These are supposed to be, Christian institutions, and they're not. They're not, and they completely violate their whole purpose for being by having been, complicit in these crimes and cover-up. So until we take these hard steps and say, who owns the land? It's really ultimately about the land. Are we going to continue to steal native land and drive them into extinction? I mean, until those things change, we can't talk about healing in Canada.
So where do we go from here?
Well, what we need is an international inquiry. You can't rely on the Canadian courts or the government to prosecute themselves. You can't rely on the churches to do the right thing. They've proven that they're not going to. So what we need is an international body, and we already have some interest in this in the European Parliament and other human rights groups. Indigenous groups around the world have supported the idea of an international war crimes tribunal that's set up to look into these crimes of genocide in Canada. We need charges laid against the people and institutions responsible. And in the meantime, what we also need is for people to take action in their own communities. Stop endorsing these churches. Stop giving money to the Catholic, Anglican, United Churches. That's one of the things that churches respond to, threats to their income. We know that the apologies started after they were threatened with lawsuits. So people can take action in their own communities, but we also need international action to say Canada is going to be condemned as a genocidal nation, and the genocide is continuing. So that's one of the things we've been working for. As a matter of fact, in October, I was over in Rome and other places in Europe to try to build support for that. I held a memorial service outside the Vatican. In April, we're hoping to go back there and take survivors of the residential schools to speak to the European media. So this is an increasingly spreading movement, and it really has to do with not just holding ourselves accountable for a crime, but really asking ourselves, can Canada be different? I think we need to reinvent Canada, not as a colonial system anymore, but as a country where people can, including Native people and whites, can live in real equality. And that means asking hard questions about who owns the land, who is running the show, and that kind of thing. So I'm hopeful that with enough education, that can begin. It's all about educating people, first of all, with the truth. And again, I just want to close on reminding people of our website, www.hiddenfromhistory.org. And our film Unrepentant. And there's a new film coming out, The Diary, which is based on my story, which should be out as a feature film in 2010 sometime.
This has been Face to Face. Thank you very much for watching.